Good morning, all ears listening. I am with Jamie Paige again. Jamie and I had a previous conversation. Jamie Paige edits and publishes the Westside Connection for the 11th District in Los Angeles. And there seem to be numerous smaller, independent, local publications starting to develop and speak to issues that are not being either broadly covered by the sensationalism of so much of the commercially driven news, and or given the specificity that would be helpful for anyone trying to understand what the hell is going on. So Jamie and I have had multiple conversations, and she is back to focus this conversation on what's happening largely on the streets of Los Angeles, but it's not an uncommon problem beyond the streets of any city in the United States and also around the world. It's a world problem and a people problem, and that's what we're here to discuss. Good morning, Jamie.
Morning, Jack. Yes, you and I have had numerous conversations about what we are seeing on the streets as a product of addictive thinking. And you and I we've talked about as a society, what we think we are doing is healthy, but it's not. It's actually contributing to the problem. I think that a lot of our readers would be interested in hearing what you have to say about specifically this addictive thinking. What you say, what we're doing over and over again is actually insanity. Would love to hear more from you about your thoughts on that.
Well, even the idea that it's a homeless problem and that it's been stigmatized as a homeless problem is interesting, because the policies generated that are creating a growing problem have been generated by people who have homes and have jobs and have cars and have families. And so if the same people developing the policies that have allowed people to die at the rate that they're dying on our street and live in conditions that if any of us allowed them to live on our own properties, we would be cited by the county health department or the city health department and fined or arrested for abuse and animal cruelty if we had animals in those conditions. And yet these conditions have festered and grown. The Skid Row solution apparently worked so well downtown, they decided to spread it citywide. And it's interesting to consider the problem, again, a homeless problem, when the policymakers all have homes. And the thinking is obviously not just the illness on the street, but there's a sick thought about how to fix this. And I would call it a misdiagnosis of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that a little more, about the misdiagnosis?
Well, if a doctor misdiagnosed a disease and kept treating the patient with the most expensive drugs and claimed that he was not culpable for their death eventually because he spent so much, he would still suffer probably a malpractice suit at least and lose his license and be subject to criminal penalties, accountability. And there seems to be no accountability on any of the people's part who are promoting these ideas that somehow or another allowing people who are clearly struggling with their own ability to support themselves in any gainful way, that are left to the streets, that giving them more latitude, this blanket immunity that's been allowed, is somehow going to help them do anything other than get worse. It's like giving a heroin addict cash. They're going to buy more heroin. It's almost a guarantee. Few of them will say, now my problem is relieved and I'm going to get back to the business of being a productive citizen. And this isn't this. The point of this is that the illness, we don't talk openly about addiction, because I would suggest that the addiction is broadly a social issue that goes well beyond the most common examples used to claim it's just the people on the street, and it's just the people who are falling down drunk, and it's just the meth addicts who haven't stopped for years, and it's just the cocaine abusers. It's rampant throughout our entire society for us to be buying $30 billion worth of cocaine from Mexico and not talking about it as a social issue in our country while blaming Mexico for sending it.
Talk more about that. That's really interesting. You're right. We like to place blame on everybody else while the chaos is happening all around us.
But that's a typical addictive, addiction treats a symptom. If I feel bad and I think feeling good is my goal, and I'm not treating the bad I'm feeling as a thought I'm having, that the feeling is actually feeling the thought I'm having that's bad, and I think what I need to do is feel better, I might pick up a drink or use a drug or become obsessed with work or become obsessed with porn or become obsessed with my cell phone or become obsessed with anything, which is a compulsion. Obsessions lead to compulsions, to distract my attention from my culpability because I'm treating the symptom rather than the disease. And the mental obsession is the primary motivator for all reactive, impulsive, and compulsive behaviors. And I don't say this as a doctor or an academic of any sort, or a philosopher or a theologian. I am simply a person who's been sober a long time and witnessed the lies, the repetition of the lies, the constant attempt to try and fix the lies by continuing to maintain the delusion that somehow escaping the lie is going to make it better. And I see it within sobriety, and I see it within people who go out after they've been sober. It's a mental obsession that leads us back. If we stop the obsession untreated, starts to drive us right back to the thing that gave us the idea. The worst idea becomes the only idea we think we can act on. And the idea that the only thing we can do is the worst thing is obviously the idea that we have no other choice. And my clarity in that is realizing that if we had no other choice, why are we blaming it on choice? It's just another example of how we turn into a victim by pretending because our back is to what we're doing, we're not doing it. And it's a lie. Humans do not wear lies well. And it isn't something that happens only on the street. The street is a perfect metaphor, a perfect reflection of the social ills that we are all participating in by thinking of that problem as impossible while not thinking of the thinking we're doing about it as being the impossibility.
Talk more about that. That's interesting. One of the things that you and I have had conversations about is if what we think we're doing is healthy, but it's really not, that it's contributing to what's happening or the problem that's taking place.
Well, enabling is the essence of addiction. And obviously, the person who is drinking, for instance, if you're an alcoholic and you start drinking, the propensity, because there's an allergy of the body at the root, alcoholics typically have bodies that can't metabolize sugar. So what the allergy basically says is an allergy is an abnormal response or an abnormal reaction to something. So what the abnormal reaction is to something we can't handle is to do more of it to try to prove we can handle it. And that's effectively addiction. When it comes to the mental ideas, the thing we're allergic to are lies or ego. And a lie as ego would be simply who I think I am, not actually who I am. So if I think who I am is all I think, then there's no wonder that we spend so much time thinking about ourselves, trying to figure out how we can get the conversation about ourselves straightened out, while we don't even notice that we're having a conversation with the self that's wholly imagined in our own head.
Can we get specific too about enabling? And right now, LA shelters require zero barrier. We're handing out Narcan on the streets. We're giving drug addicts, as you said, cash, money. Talk about what you think that looks like. And is this part of enabling what's happening?
Well, it's interesting that we would discount we could do anything about it until people overdose, and then we all of a sudden have a remedy. And to think that there are no other options in between an absolute building of enough housing for everyone who's out there, which is impossible, by the way, because the costs involved. I mean, here's another aspect of addictive thinking. When you're spending as much as possible on the claimed solution, you're actually committing to the least number of people to be served. So that's a commitment to failure. Again, if you look accurately at what's happening, you can see that bankrupt ideas that have no substance have no useful, gainful purpose. So you can spend billions and trillions, and it's not going to work. Principled choices are based on laws of nature, laws of the things that work, that are useful. If something doesn't work long enough, and I think we've had a 40-year history of watching people on our street and done almost nothing to offset it in any gainful manner, it would be a pretty good suggestion in my estimation that something we're doing is wrong. And to allow it to continue and just keep doubling down is pretty much what we've been doing. It's an indication that we've never looked accurately at what's happening. We've never talked about it openly as a society and start to notice that our culpability in it is our own inaccuracy and our own perpetuation of this mythology that somehow it's impossible, while it's the idea it's impossible that is actually creating the impossibility. People are fully dignified, completely intact human beings, and we're treating them as though they're completely unable to do anything but the worst we can expect of them. And we in that thought are condemning them we're condemning ourselves and them for us to see only that in them rather than the other possibilities. And one of the things we did in Venice some years back with a woman named Regina Weller, who worked with her husband Steve, and did outreach on the street. They went out and talked to people, introduced themselves, got to know them. They also brought the police with them, recognizing that there were people out there who were not very friendly and not very happy, and many of them were ill-willed and dangerous. So they would go with the police, but they'd talk to people. And she called some of the locals and raised $2,500. And we sent 13 people home who had been lured to LA on the premise that if you come here and sleep on the street for a year or two, you're going to get a condo. So you're going to be able to live in a city that you couldn't afford to live in otherwise, and actually leave a city. Many of these people, and I've interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of people from cities around the country that have affordable housing, that came here because of the open welcome mat, social media saying, you can come here. There's no consequence for whatever you do if you live on the street in a tent, and you can live anywhere. And the Boise decision, if I remember correctly, and I think you know it better than I do, did not say that people can live wherever they want, in whatever structures they want, for as long as they want. It simply said that that you could not criminalize people for sleeping on the street. And the hours that were determined to be the sleeping hours were 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. It didn't say 24 hours a day. It didn't say everyone everywhere. It didn't say build structures that are fire hazards, that are dangerous, living in health conditions that are well beneath any civilized community, and being subject to people who have absolutely no interest in any rule whatsoever, but getting exactly what they can get for their own purposes. That was not what it said. That's been allowed by the policymakers, claiming it's compassionate. How can it be compassionate if the net result is a growing population of people who are dying at an increasing rate? It's just like
Jack,
it's like an
that's
alcoholic.
a really good question. And I think people want to know the answer to that question. How is compassion letting people deteriorate and die on the streets?
It just isn't compassionate, and it isn't an answer, and it isn't a solution. You can quickly see a problem, because problems, when they're continued to be treated by the same thinking that created the problem, will continue to get worse. And if you're not using the evidence accurately, you're going to then use it to justify that the problem you're making get worse is now even justifying your thought that got it worse to begin with, to double down and do more in the wrong direction. And that's exactly what is going on. There are people, even within the structure of people who are running for office right now, who are committed to leaving everyone on the street until all of the housing is built. That is like holding people hostage, kidnapping them, forcing them into dereliction for an ideal that is not ideal at all.
One of the things that I saw yesterday at Centennial Park is a young woman and her mom who had come from Ohio. I think I first met them in November. And I said to the young woman, she had been approached, her and I had been approached by a couple of males, and they wanted us to take something from them. I said no. And I just looked her in the eyes and I said, you need to leave this encampment. It's not safe for you. Something bad is going to happen to you. She was terrified. It was her only option. As you said, she discovered Centennial Park on social media. And I said, please take whatever help you can get. Whoever offers it to you, take it, obviously from St. Joseph's or whatever the provider was. she had been in the encampment up until yesterday. When she was leaving, finally going to another place, I told her I was happy for her and wished her the best. And she said she wasn't happy and that this was her community and her way of living now. And that the only reason she was leaving was because of her mom. So this young woman goes from being fearful and being in an unknown place to having now a community and not wanting to leave this encampment.
Yes.
And she clearly had physically deteriorated from day one to the last day.
When we allow people to be subject to threats and anxiety, we're going to help them get worse. And that's what's happening. People are insulating themselves in a community that isn't safe by making themselves part of it, so they become protected by it. But what they're being protected by now is a threat. That's a
guaranteed. And I'm sure the addiction, whatever, was taking place, she did not look well. She physically had deteriorated along the way. And I think part of what's happening with these large encampments, we saw it last year on the boardwalk, is we're creating a society that's really hard to disassemble, for lack of a better word. And my guess is, you're the expert on this, it's part of the addiction.
Well, what's interesting about it, again, in relation to the idea that somehow allowing them to deteriorate and degenerate and disintegrate the way we are is going to help them, is the fact that the housing that is being talked about would not allow any of them in it if they were unwilling to abide by rules. Nobody's talking about that. We're basically cultivating the opinion that they have absolutely no regard for consequences, and there are no consequences. So they can, as many people who have been given short-term housing have gone in and destroyed the housing and been evicted as a result or kicked out in some way. And I think the move to the hotel in Culver City was a pretty good example of that.
Are you talking about the encampment to Culver City?
Yeah.
Yes.
Where the crime rate doubled around the hotel that was offered to 30 people, and they closed it down. So to think that somehow we're making people better by creating savage situations and reducing people to their most primal instinct of fear is an interesting concept to even entertain without recognizing the absurdity of it and talk about it openly enough to do something.
But here's my question about that. And we covered this story extensively because, yes, you took a group who had lived in an encampment, about an 80+ person encampment on Rose Avenue. There was a high crime, high fire danger, all of these things that were taking place. And then we just packed them up and put a roof over their head in a hotel with no wraparound services, no accountability, as you said. And that the crime that happened on Rose just moved over to the hotel. You're right. They closed the program down after a month and a half. And my question is, why did we just repeat that same model again, which we're seeing now from the boardwalk encampment to home?
Addiction is the idea that the same Einstein, I'm no Einstein, but Albert was. And he said, you can't fix a problem with the same thinking that created it. But addiction thinks if you keep focusing on it and keep pushing it, someday a lie will become true and a wrong thought will become right. And if the basis of the thinking is corrupt, the consequence is going to be corrupt. But it's an interesting twist that happens in our psyche that we seem to go into a hypnotic trance, repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating the wrong behavior, thinking someday it will be right, not noticing the evidence is telling us the whole time it's wrong because things are getting worse. So we end up using the worsening conditions to claim that our need for more and more and more of the thing we're doing is right. And that sounds to me an awful lot like an addictive compulsion. Sounds like exactly what alcoholics do, exactly what drug addicts do, exactly what people who take oxytocin or Percocet or Oxycontin and all those drugs that are painkillers. If you are ignoring the problem will grow. So you're going to need more of the supposed solution to treat the symptom. And what are you doing? Overdosing. And that same overdosing is the same dose that we're prescribing to the same people who are getting worse, saying, we're going to allow you to get even worse to help justify the idea that we need to maintain this homeless, I think somebody referred to it as the homeless industrial complex, and just spend more and more and more and more money that's all being subsidized by the economy in a direction that it will never solve the problem, because there's no basis to that solution. The basis, it's bankrupt to begin with, because we're talking about people as a one size fits all. They're homeless and they all qualify under the same umbrella. And unfortunately, the people that are recyclable early on, because I think of recovery as a recycling program of humanity, bringing them back to their full capacity rather than having them operating on fumes, literally. That program diminishes the capacity of many people who are interested in help and would take the help and would restore their own capacity to function within society in a gainful manner enough, at least to support themselves, because they deteriorate like the woman you're describing, to the point where they think it's the only thing they can do, and they're just going to hang with the friends that they have and they've developed that are basically protecting them from some outside threat, when the actual threat they're being protected from is the one they're living in.
That's what I saw.
Insanity. It is insanity, and we don't talk about it openly as a society, and that's what our mental obsession discussion is doing.
And one of the things you've pointed out too is the impact of this is the worst for the most vulnerable people on the streets.
Yes.
And we see this as human beings, watching fellow human beings deteriorate in front of us. And a lot of people in Venice specifically are crying for help, for sometimes themselves, but mostly for the things that we see every day that we know are wrong.
Well, they know it's wrong too, Jamie. Their suffering is the cry for help, even when they are the angry, hostile, reactive, violent people. The violence is a cry for help. Violence is a clear admission that something's seriously wrong, to get to a point where you think the best thing you can do is the worst thing you can do. And those are all cries for help. And to ignore that is to think that what we need to do is wait for them to ask for help, which is part of the county's contention, that if they don't ask, you can't do anything about it. They keep counting everybody, but they don't take their names unless they're asking for help. They have no seeming need to actually count people. So they don't really know what the count is, because they don't even know the people. They don't even know their names. And we talk about them as a population of people, and we don't even have their names and don't think we have the right to even ask. That's a pretty isolated version of humanity. I generally, when I meet anyone, I get a name. And my experience with people on the street is when I give them my name, they're much more likely to give me their name, though they typically give me a street name first and then tell me their real name. And the fact is, almost every single one of these people, and I say almost because some of these kids grew up in foster care and were abandoned early on in life and never had anything other than the camaraderie of other people who were similarly destitute in some way. But most of these people have families, have people that care about them, have mothers, have fathers. And if they're asked about them, and that's what I do, I don't tend to talk about sobriety right away. I just say, where's your mom? And everybody kind of bows their head and says, oh, she's in Cincinnati. I said, have you talked to her? No. I said, you might want to call her, because I can guarantee you she's thinking about you and wondering about you and your welfare. And, well, I did this and I did that. And I said, you know what? Love does not limit its concern to what you did in the past. It's much more interested in what you're willing to do in the present. And mothers are pretty good examples of people who tend to go further for another human being than most of us do. And I think that's a good example to set in our own consideration of what we can do as humans.
I've seen it too. I've seen it in the reunification. You're right. It's one of the first things they do is talk about calling home. We have an election coming up, a very important one, some very important seats. And as you had talked about earlier, we have some politicians who are talking about solutions, others who want to repeat the same thing that we're seeing over and over again. I don't want to get into that as much as what you have said before is we vote every day, but it's just as important that we vote in an intelligent way in these elections. Let's talk about that.
Quality versus quantity is the difference between being productive and principled thinking, and the difference between doing more. You can do more that's less valuable. That's what we're doing now. We're doing a lot of what's not valuable. So we're seeing the results fail. And that would be the same in any business if it chose to do something that didn't work and think that we're going to take all our employees and just keep doing more of what doesn't work and watch it fail. And we make choices all day long. One of the free things we have as humans is the choice to think. And it isn't so much thinking, I would say, maybe isn't a choice because it seems fundamental to our bodies and our brains and the way that we're designed. But what we think is a choice of what we have control over. And how we think about the things we think about is a choice we have. And when we undermine that choice, we are under the impression that everything's just happening to us rather than being caused by us. And to think that everything's happening to us, again, shows that thinking has an impact on how we experience things. So in voting, my experience is that we're always choosing, we're always voting, we're always making choices every day. And every choice we make, like the economy would be a good example. Every dollar we spend and every dollar we don't spend affects the economy all day long. Everything we do affects the economy. So to say that we don't want any part of the economy is to say something that couldn't be possible because we are part of that economy. We're either draining it or we're adding to it. We're either productive or we're unproductive. And in voting, the question is, why have we as a population that far outnumbers the people that end up in those seats that we give them, allow this sort of thing to go on as though somehow, someday it will get better if we just keep doing the same old thing and barely even notice what we're doing in the process and just vote for the sake of saying, yeah, I voted, but I really don't know who these people are or what they're doing, and really look at the records. And it's a tedious effort. But I would say if we think we're doing it alone, we're missing the benefit of all the other people in our midst who have taken some time and looked and listened and could be gainful in the conversation enough to value what they say and at least put some question in front of the conclusions we've come to offer the kind of depth that might make the difference to start seeing things happen in a way. And to me, the voting isn't over at the ballot box. It's the beginning and our own participation to help people who we've elected say, look, we are your populace. We voted you in to represent us, not to come up with some excursion of your own that has nothing to do, that has something to do with the few and not much to do with the many, other than the fact that we're bearing the consequence of those decisions that are made in derogatory, negative ways. And what's interesting is what used to be exclusive to Venice is now pretty much common and aware to all of the 11 district people throughout LA, I would say. It used to seem like something that just happened here and not everywhere else. And everyone's saying, oh, if the problem is allowed to continue, it's going to grow. And it has. And it's subjected people to fire hazards and health hazards and rapes. And as you know from the guy that you went through that trial with that raped that 67-year-old woman in Santa Monica, these things aren't coincidences. They are consequences of allowing this kind of thing to go on. Just like the guy who ran the woman over on the boardwalk with his car, who thought one day the best thing he could do is just run people down on the boardwalk. Those things don't happen as isolated incidents. They only seem to be because we excuse ourselves from the culpability we have from being in the social structure that allows those socially ill things to happen, and then discounts our own culpability in having those things happen.
I think that's a great point that you brought. And I love your analogy too of a lot of us voters want to make educated decisions so we can kind of go back in cruise control in our lives. We expect for our politicians to make the important decisions, but you're right. Right now, it's imperative that we educate ourselves before we go to the polls, because we do have 3 murder trials coming up where our senior citizens were beat to death on our streets and our sidewalks. And this, as we're seeing, is a direct result of policies and procedures.
Well, and when those murders were reported, they didn't happen to mention the people that caused those, that committed or allegedly committed those murders were all living on the street. Which to me would be a good warning to people to say, look, my greater sense, Jamie, is that I'm an alcoholic. I'm a drug addict. I'm 34 years sober. I'm incredibly grateful for the freedom and the insight that I was given by people who cared enough to take the time to begin to melt the block of density that I used to use for 17 of 31 years prior to my sobriety. And I know In Los Angeles, there were 3,000 meetings a week before COVID, 3,000 meetings a week. And those meetings would be attended by 10 to 100 people. There are a lot of people in our community in Los Angeles who are uniquely qualified to help people struggling with meth, coke, alcohol, fentanyl, whatever it is. The broad base of recovery in our city, which is huge, has had those experiences which make people uniquely qualified to talk to people about that and have a greater chance of having that person respond because of that connection. And those people right now, many of them I know, including myself, are marginalized by the conditions that have been allowed that are dangerous. And anyone in their right, sober mind wouldn't engage in without being concerned for their safety. And so we keep a distance. Some of the primary work of sobriety is done by helping other people who are crying out for help. And when it started, it wasn't people that said, I need help. They went to places they knew they needed help because they were in detox centers and hospital beds and on the sides of railroads and other places. They went and just talked to people. And we can't do that today safely because of the conditions that have been allowed. So one of the greatest resources available is squandered by allowing things to become so deteriorated, and the deterioration supports the deterioration, which supports and just continues to fester. As long as we don't talk about it accurately and honestly, it will continue to grow because it will be considered the right thing by the few brains that are perpetuating the policies that are allowing it to happen. And one of the things you pointed out recently with the $5 million that was given for the oceanfront is that half of it has so far been spent on administrative. And when the administrative costs are offsetting the potential to help the people, it isn't helping. It's again a commitment to failure. It's a commitment to serve the few in the name of ignoring the many and claiming that it's the best thing we can do. And that would be ridiculous if a father in a family bought a $100,000 car when they had no food in the refrigerator. It's so obvious analogy. And simple metaphors, and yet socially we put up with this and don't talk about it honestly and look at it and say, wow, we have spent hundreds of millions of dollars administrating help that has not worked. It's a pretty good indication that we're putting money in a direction that isn't working.
That's a great analogy. And I want to mention that we do have a voter's guide on westsidecurrent.com that people can go to and educate themselves. We've interviewed almost all of the candidates, and we've looked at their platforms. We looked at their spending. We've gone in depth, and we did our homework for the people who are going to the polls. We believe that's our responsibility. You also have a podcast where you talk about addiction. We know, Jack, this is going up on your segment as part of our partnership. And you talk a lot about these subjects in depth. And I look forward to having these conversations in the future with you, because you and I both believe it needs to be talked about more.
Well, then our primary focus is not the social ills and the politics and all that, which I like to stay away from so that it's sort of neutral. Our focus is on the individual who has reactive, impulsive, and compulsive behaviors, or is suffering from depression and anxiety and stress. Because the conditions, if the basis of our existence was based on a lie, we would feel great lying. And the fact is, the basis of our existence is based on truth. And if we act...
I was going to just say quickly that there was a crossroads right now, and that's why you and I are having this conversation. Politics plays a big role in the addictions and what we're seeing on the streets. So,
well, what we're seeing, though, is the collective nature of group thinking. And if we treat the collective nature, we think maybe we're not part of it, rather than start to see that each of our decisions every day is what affects that collective nature. And it's starting to look at our culpability as individuals. That was part of my point, was just getting back to the fact that if I'm living in anxiety and stress, the chances are I'm going to be very protective about what I'm doing and feel isolated and feel like I'm not a part of it, while in fact I'm impacting in a negative way the part I could be playing in a more productive, gainful, useful way. So that's our focus in the podcast. And it generalizes to include everyone. It isn't small, and I'm not trying to isolate politics as something that's distinct from it, but starting to show that if the basic thinking that we're doing is contaminated and polluted, the chances are the actions we're going to take are going to be exactly like they are right now. And I would say that is our responsibility as a society. As a species, it's the same responsibility because no one is outside the purview of the nature of our human existence. And that means all things and all people, nature, the universe, it's all part of what we are expressing and have the capacity to express in the best way, rather than linger in this sort of doubtful nature that is literally questioning what we're doing. And we don't even notice that when we're living in doubt and uncertainty, we're probably thinking doubtful thoughts that are uncertain.
Yes, and I love all of your topics as well. I think I think that one of the reasons we want to have these conversations and can continue to is we both agree that it needs to be talked about more.
Yes.
And you offer a platform and I offer a platform to give people access to information like this. So I'm looking forward to having more conversations with you in the future and learning more from you and having our readers learn more from and listening to We Know Jack.
Well, thank you. And to that point, we as humans are uniquely qualified to use language and develop language, as we have hundreds and hundreds of languages and symbolism to communicate with one another. That's a unique trait amongst us. And to not use it as one of our primary forms, I would say, undermines our capacity to take advantage of the opportunity that each of us offer each other in terms of perspective. And that's a big part of the goal to begin with.
So more topics to come.
Yes, daily.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, Jamie, for your interest and your time and the chance to allow your audience to share our thoughts and thinking very much.
The appreciation is mutual. Thank you.